The continent of Europe fell under the massive shadow of the advancing German war machine. The island nation of Britain stood isolated and braced for a brutal assault from the clouds. The supreme commanders across the Channel prepared a massive aerial armada to crush the remaining resistance. Thousands of enemy bombers and fighters gathered on the captured airfields of France. The fate of the free world rested on the shoulders of a few brave men in the sky. The Royal Air Force possessed a brilliant defensive network to counter the incoming massive threat. The commanders built a complex system of radar stations and observation posts along the coast. This intricate web of information allowed the British officers to track the massive enemy formations. They directed their interceptor squadrons with a cold and calculated mathematical precision. The survival of the nation depended on this strict organization and absolute discipline. The British aviation engineers provided their defenders with spectacular machines of war. The Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire stood ready on the green grass of the airfields. These aircraft were masterpieces of modern aeronautical design and raw mechanical power. The Merlin engines roared with a deep and aggressive tone that shook the solid ground. But the finest machines in the world meant nothing without brave men to push the throttles forward. The massive scale of the German aerial campaign inflicted a heavy toll on the British defensive ranks. The relentless combat missions drained the physical and mental endurance of the brave young pilots. The commanders watched their roster of experienced men shrink with each passing week of intense combat. They needed fresh warriors to man the empty cockpits and hold the fragile defensive line. The desperate search for capable aviators brought unexpected reinforcements from across the sea. Hundreds of exiled aviators arrived on the British shores with burning vengeance in their hearts. These men hailed from the shattered nation of Poland after the brutal invasion of their homeland. They survived the destruction of their own air force and escaped through immense danger. The exiled warriors crossed the continent to find a new base of operations against their hated enemy. They possessed a profound desire to return to the skies and inflict massive damage. The Polish aviators were hardened veterans of intense and chaotic combat operations. They possessed a deep understanding of the German aerial tactics and the capabilities of the enemy machines. Their profound combat experience forged them into ruthless and aggressive hunters of the sky. They viewed the impending battle over Britain as a continuation of their own interrupted war. The men begged the British commanders for airplanes and a chance to resume the fight. But the Royal Air Force leadership faced a massive and practical problem with the foreign volunteers. The entire British defensive strategy depended on constant and precise radio communication. The radar operators directed the fighter squadrons to the exact coordinates of the incoming bombers. This complex system required absolute verbal comprehension in the heat of a chaotic engagement. The language barrier presented a profound and fatal danger in the crowded airspace. Most of the Polish veterans could not understand a single word of the English language. A pilot who failed to comprehend a sudden order could ruin a massive coordinated ambush. The misinterpretation of a radio vector could lead an entire formation into a deadly enemy trap. The British officers could not risk the integrity of their defensive shield on simple translation errors. The fundamental combat doctrines of the two allied nations also clashed in the briefing rooms. The British training emphasized tight formations and disciplined defensive maneuvers at high altitudes. The Royal Air Force preferred calculated and organized strikes against the enemy bomber streams. The Polish aviators possessed a much more aggressive and chaotic approach to aerial combat. They preferred to break formation and engage the enemy fighters in close quarters, brawls. The British commanders made a rational and logical decision based on the massive risks. They grounded the eager Polish veterans and placed them in strict training programs. The men who had survived brutal combat found themselves riding bicycles around the quiet airfields. The Royal Air Force demanded that the exiles master the English language before touching an airplane. The strict rules of the British system frustrated the men who just wanted to fight. The veteran pilots sat in sterile classrooms and memorized altitude measurements and basic compass directions. The instructors forced them to repeat simple phrases while the sirens wailed in the distance. The proud warriors felt insulted by the elementary lessons and the constant delays. They watched the brave British pilots launch into the dangerous skies day after day. The massive smoke plumes over London fueled their intense rage and their profound impatience. The British officers recognized the immense skill of the foreign pilots during the initial flight tests. The Polish men handled the modern Hawker Hurricanes with an aggressive and masterful touch. They pushed the powerful machines to the absolute edge of their mechanical limits during the training flights. The instructors marveled at the sheer instinct and the raw talent of the exiled aviators, but the strict orders from the high command kept the ferocious warriors chained to the ground. The situation in the skies over the island grew more desperate with the passing of each long week. The massive swarms of German bombers pounded the industrial centers and the vital airfields. The relentless pressure pushed the British defensive network to the absolute breaking point. The brave defenders were exhausted and outnumbered in the massive vertical arena. The commanders knew they could not hold the dark tide without committing all available forces to the battle. The logic of keeping experienced killers on the ground began to crumble under the immense weight of the war. The British realized that absolute linguistic perfection was less important than a high volume of airborne guns. The complex radio commands mattered little when the enemy was mere yards away in the thick clouds. The survival of the nation required machines in the air and aggressive men pulling the triggers. The rigid rules of the peacetime training manual dissolved in the intense heat of the crisis. The Polish aviators of Squadron 303 received their official orders to prepare for active combat. The mechanics fueled the sleek Hawker Hurricanes and loaded the wings with thousands of armor-piercing rounds. The atmosphere in the briefing room transformed from bitter frustration to intense and focused anticipation. The exiled men zipped up their leather flight jackets and walked toward the waiting machines on the grass. The period of quiet waiting and elementary language lessons was at an absolute end. The British Engineering Division provided the perfect weapon for the unique style of the Polish fighters. The Hurricane was a rugged and durable machine that could absorb massive amounts of combat damage. It possessed a tight turning radius that made it a lethal predator in a chaotic dogfight. The thick wings provided a stable platform for the massive battery of 8 rapid-fire machine guns. The combination of British steel and Polish aggression created a profound and devastating synergy. The engines roared to life and shattered the calm morning silence of the English countryside. The massive propellers chewed the air as the squadron accelerated down the long green runway. The heavy fighters lifted into the sky and formed a tight V shape above the clouds. The British sector controllers watched the radar screens and guided the new unit toward the incoming massive threat. The first major test of the foreign volunteers was approaching with terrifying speed. The Polish pilots scanned the horizon and searched for the distinct dark spots of the German bomber formations. The radio crackled with broken English and tense Polish chatter as the men acquired their massive targets. The massive enemy armada stretched across the sky like a dark storm of pure destruction. The sheer numbers of the incoming planes would terrify a rookie aviator on his first combat mission, but the men of the 303 felt nothing but a cold and focused desire to kill. The British controllers ordered the squadron to maintain altitude and execute a standard organized attack. But the sight of the hated enemy ignited a fire in the hearts of the exiled warriors. The strict lessons of the training classrooms evaporated in the thin and freezing air. The Polish commander shouted a brief command and shoved the throttle of his Hurricane forward. The entire squadron broke the standard formation and dove straight into the heart of the massive enemy swarm. The British radar operators watched in absolute shock as the blips on their screens merged into a massive, chaotic brawl. The organized defensive strategy dissolved into a ferocious and brutal close-quarters knife fight in the clouds. The exiled pilots unleashed years of profound anger and absolute frustration upon the German machines. The sky filled with the bright flash of tracer rounds and the dark trails of burning aviation fuel. The desperate defense of the island had entered a new and terrifying phase of sheer aggression. The combination of the brilliant British machines and the relentless Polish fury caught the enemy off guard. The German pilots expected a disciplined and predictable defensive maneuver from the Royal Air Force. They faced a swarm of mechanical hornets that ignored the rules of standard aerial engagements. The Polish fighters closed the distance to mere feet before unleashing massive torrents of hot lead. The sheer violence of the sudden assault shattered the massive bomber formation in a matter of seconds. The Battle of Britain was about to witness a display of aerial carnage that would echo through history. The men who lost their homes had found a new massive arena to exact their absolute vengeance. The British commanders would soon realize they had unleashed a weapon of pure and unadulterated devastation. The sky belonged to the brave men who refused to surrender to the dark shadow of the massive empire. The legend of the deadliest fighter squadron of the entire massive conflict was born in the fire. The German bomber formations flew in a tight and massive box to maximize their defensive firepower. Hundreds of heavy machine guns pointed in every direction to create an impenetrable wall of lead. The Luftwaffe commanders believed this massive airborne fortress could crush any coordinated attack from the Royal Air Force. They expected the British interceptors to engage from a safe distance and fire in short and disciplined bursts. The standard doctrine of the era dictated a cautious approach to minimize severe mechanical damage and pilot casualties. The men of the 303 Squadron ignored every single rule written in the modern combat manuals. They pushed the throttles of their Hawker Hurricanes to the absolute maximum limit and screamed toward the enemy. The Polish commander led his massive wedge of fighters on a direct collision course with the leading German bombers. The sheer closing speed of the heavy machines left the enemy gunners with zero time to calculate a precise aim. The exiled warriors charged the flying fortresses with the raw aggression of a medieval cavalry strike. A massive wall of green camouflage and spinning metal shattered the disciplined German formation in a chaotic instant. The Polish pilots refused to press their triggers from the standard and recommended combat distance of 300 yards. They possessed a profound hatred for the invaders who bombed their homes and murdered their innocent families. The desire for absolute vengeance demanded a much closer and far more personal application of raw violence. The men of the squadron closed the gap until the massive enemy bombers filled their entire front windshields. Firing a massive battery of 8 machine guns at point-blank range produced a spectacular and devastating effect. The thick, armor-piercing rounds tore massive holes through the aluminum skin of the German machines. The concentrated kinetic energy severed vital control cables and shattered the heavy glass of the bomber cockpits. The Polish fighters flew so close to their targets that the hot engine oil from the dying bombers splashed across their own glass canopies. The air filled with the sharp stench of aviation fuel and the violent noise of tearing metal. The sudden and brutal ferocity of the assault shocked the veteran German crews out of their rigid combat discipline. They had fought the brave British pilots in dozens of massive engagements over the English Channel and the mainland. The Royal Air Force always presented a tough and calculating defense that respected the limits of the machines. But this new swarm of interceptors fought with a chaotic and suicidal disregard for their own absolute safety. The German bomber pilots broke their tight defensive boxes and scattered into the clouds in pure panic. The dispersion of the massive bomber stream signaled the beginning of a brutal and unforgiving slaughter in the sky. The isolated German machines became prime targets for the agile and rugged British fighter planes. The Hawker Hurricane proved to be the perfect instrument for the aggressive and close-quarters style of the Polish men. The thick wings of the British machine provided a stable platform for the massive volume of incoming and outgoing fire. The rugged airframe absorbed brutal punishment that would shatter a lesser aircraft into 1,000,000 pieces. A single Polish pilot targeted a massive twin-engine bomber desperate to escape the chaotic combat zone. He jammed his throttle forward and chased the heavy machine through a thick bank of white clouds. The German rear gunner fired frantic bursts of hot tracer rounds that snapped past the wings of the Hurricane. The exiled warrior ignored the incoming fire and kept his eyes fixed on the massive tail of the enemy plane. He waited until the absolute last second before squeezing the heavy firing button on his control stick. A solid stream of lead ripped the tail section of the bomber into a shower of twisted metal and bright sparks. The massive German machine lost all aerodynamic stability and entered a fatal spin toward the ground below. The Polish pilot pulled his control stick back and soared above the massive fireball with a cold sense of satisfaction. He possessed zero pity for the men inside the burning wreckage falling into the dark ocean. The brutal mathematics of vengeance erased all concepts of standard military mercy in the freezing air. The chaotic dogfight spread across miles of airspace and pushed the men to the edge of absolute physical exhaustion. The high-gravity turns drained the blood from their heads and strained the muscles in their tired necks. The roar of the Merlin engines deafened their ears, while the thick smell of cordite burned their lungs. The British sector controllers listened to the frantic radio chatter and realized the complete breakdown of their standard tactical plan. The massive organized ambush had devolved into a massive bar fight thousands of feet above the earth. The officers in the underground bunkers expected a massive disaster when the Polish fighters broke their assigned formation. They feared the aggressive foreign volunteers would fall victim to the disciplined crossfire of the German defensive boxes. But the radar screens painted a much different and massive picture of the brutal engagement unfolding in the clouds. The distinct green blips representing the enemy bombers vanished from the massive glass map at a staggering rate. The chaotic swarm of British machines was erasing the German armada from the sky with unprecedented speed. The Luftwaffe escort fighters dove from the high altitudes to protect their massive and vulnerable bombers. Sleek German interceptors swooped down and attempted to bounce the Polish Hurricanes in the middle of the chaotic furball. The enemy possessed faster machines that held a massive advantage in vertical dives and high-speed passes. But the exiled warriors used the incredible turn radius of their British planes to negate the massive speed advantage. The Hawker Hurricane could outturn any German fighter in a sustained and horizontal turning engagement. A Polish pilot noticed a German fighter dropping from the sun to target the tail of his wingman. He reefed his heavy machine into a massive and violent turn that pinned him against his canvas seat. The rugged British airframe groaned under the immense stress, but held together with absolute mechanical integrity. The exiled warrior pulled his nose across the flight path of the diving enemy and opened a massive wall of fire. The German fighter flew straight into the stream of bullets and exploded into a massive cloud of black smoke. The combination of the stable British gun platform and the aggressive Polish pilot created an invincible fighting unit. The men of the 303 Squadron fought with a profound synergy that defied all standard military expectations. They covered each other in the massive chaos and operated on a shared wavelength of pure and unadulterated hatred. The language barrier vanished in the air because the language of raw combat required zero translation or complex grammar. A simple shout over the radio or a quick wag of the wings communicated massive volumes of tactical data. The German pilots realized they were bleeding men and machines at an unsustainable and terrifying pace. The strict discipline of the Luftwaffe collapsed under the massive pressure of the relentless point-blank assaults. The surviving bomber crews dumped their massive payloads into the open ocean and turned their broken machines toward France. The escort fighters abandoned the chaotic dogfight and pushed their engines to the limit to escape the vicious swarm. The massive armada of the German Empire was in a state of absolute and chaotic retreat across the Channel. The Polish fighters chased the fleeing enemy until their massive ammunition bays ran dry and their fuel gauges hit empty. They possessed a burning desire to pursue the retreating bombers clear back to their captured French airfields. But the brilliant British machines required fuel, and the men needed a massive resupply of heavy armor-piercing ammunition. The squadron commander gave the order to break off the pursuit and return to their designated home base. The men of the 303 descended from the clouds and brought their smoking machines back to the earth. The ground crews at the British airfield waited with intense anxiety as the distant roar of the engines returned. They expected to see a shattered squadron returning with massive casualties and broken aircraft from the chaotic engagement. The strict British officers anticipated a massive disciplinary nightmare to address the blatant disregard for standard aerial formations. But the sight of the returning Hawker Hurricanes changed the entire atmosphere of the massive military base. The mechanics counted the planes and realized the entire squadron had survived the massive and brutal encounter. The heavy machines rolled to a stop on the grass, and the exhausted pilots slid their glass canopies back. The wings of the British fighters were stained with the dark oil and the fresh blood of the shattered German bombers. The mechanics found massive pieces of enemy aluminum lodged in the engine cowlings of the rugged Hurricane fighters. The sheer volume of combat damage proved the Polish men had fought at a distance that defied all rational logic. The ground crews stared in absolute awe at the foreign warriors climbing out of the metal cockpits. The British intelligence officers rushed to the flight line to debrief the men and calculate the massive combat results. The exiled pilots described the chaotic furball and claimed a staggering number of confirmed enemy kills in the sky. The initial reports sounded like the massive exaggerations of arrogant and boastful rookie fighter pilots. The strict officers demanded absolute proof to verify the massive claims of destruction from the single combat mission. The validation of the massive kill count required a thorough investigation of the gun camera footage and the wreckage. The review of the combat data confirmed a truth that shattered the rigid expectations of the Royal Air Force. The Polish squadron had destroyed more enemy machines in a single engagement than any other veteran British unit. The aggressive point-blank tactics and the rugged British airframes produced a massive and unparalleled harvest of German metal. The foreign volunteers had proven their massive worth in the most violent and brutal arena of the entire war. The decision to arm the exiled warriors was a massive and absolute strategic triumph for the island nation. The news of the massive success spread through the underground bunkers and the active fighter command centers. The British generals recognized the profound impact of the Polish fury on the fragile defensive lines of the nation. The strict rules regarding radio communication and standard formations faced massive revisions to accommodate the aggressive new allies. The Royal Air Force embraced the chaos and integrated the fierce warriors into the massive heart of their defensive shield. The language barrier became a minor inconvenience compared to the massive volume of falling German bombers. The men of the 303 Squadron earned the profound respect of their brave British brothers in arms. The shared trauma of the massive aerial battles forged an unbreakable bond of steel and spilled blood. The British pilots recognized the Polish men as absolute equals in the desperate struggle to save the free world. The exiled warriors found a new home and a massive new purpose in the damp and foggy airfields of England. They transformed from grounded and frustrated refugees into the apex predators of the European skies. The German commanders across the Channel stared at the massive casualty reports with a cold sense of dread. The invincible armada of the Luftwaffe had struck a massive wall of British engineering and foreign vengeance. The simple narrative of a quick and easy victory over the isolated island nation dissolved in the burning wreckage. The enemy realized that a new and terrifying force was operating the heavy machines of the Royal Air Force. The battle for the skies was about to enter its most massive and bloody phase. The pace of the aerial war over the island shifted into a relentless and brutal gear. The German commanders across the Channel hurled wave after wave of massive bomber formations at the British coast. The sirens wailed across the grassy airfields of the Royal Air Force from dawn until dusk. The men of the 303 Squadron pushed their minds and bodies past the limits of human endurance. They flew 3 or 4 intense combat sorties every single day in the freezing high-altitude air. The massive physical toll of the high-speed dogfights left the Polish pilots exhausted and dehydrated. But the true unsung heroes of the massive defensive effort worked in the dirt and the oil on the ground. The British mechanics and ground crews bore the immense weight of keeping the fighter squadrons airborne. These dedicated men ran toward the returning Hawker Hurricanes before the massive propellers even stopped spinning. They climbed onto the hot metal wings and opened the access panels to reload the massive machine guns. Heavy belts of armor-piercing ammunition were dragged across the grass and fed into the empty weapons. The mechanics pumped hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel into the tanks, while the engines ticked and cooled. The state of the returning British machines painted a grim picture of the extreme violence in the clouds. The rugged Hurricane fighters came back riddled with massive jagged holes from German cannon fire. The British engineers worked miracles with sheets of raw aluminum and heavy rivet guns to patch the shattered wings. They wiped the dark engine oil and the soot from the glass canopies to give the pilots a clear view of the enemy. Sometimes the ground crews had to wash the blood of wounded Polish aviators from the tight confines of the cockpits. A profound and silent bond forged in sweat, and heavy combat stress united the men of both nations. The British mechanics possessed immense pride in the rugged machines they maintained for the foreign volunteers. They watched the Polish pilots push the Hurricane airframes to the absolute edge of mechanical destruction and return victorious. The exiled warriors recognized that their massive success in the sky depended on the brilliant sweat of the British engineers. A simple nod from a soot-covered Polish pilot to a grease-stained British mechanic spoke volumes of pure mutual respect. The massive language barrier vanished in the shared mission to keep the enemy bombers away from the vulnerable cities. The Royal Air Force Base transformed into an intense and unified ecosystem of pure survival and aggressive defense. The British provided the steel shield, and the Polish provided the sharp sword. The seamless cooperation on the grass airstrips confused the German intelligence officers monitoring the massive battle. The enemy could not understand how the British airfields continued to launch such massive and relentless interceptor waves. They underestimated the raw industrial resilience of the British ground crews and the supreme stamina of the exiled pilots. The men on the ground refused to let a single serviceable machine sit idle while their brothers fought in the sky. The relentless cycle of launching and repairing created a continuous nightmare for the massive German armada. The heavy roar of the Merlin engines became a massive symphony of hope for the exhausted British civilians hiding below. The citizens knew the massive machines and the brave men were fighting a desperate and brutal war of absolute attrition. The British mechanics slept under the wings of the massive fighters to save time during the short summer nights. The Polish pilots dozed in their heavy canvas flight suits, while they waited for the next flare from the command tower. The combined forces of two proud nations stood firm against the massive and terrifying dark storm. The combat over the island turned into a brutal grinder of metal and men. The warriors of the 303 Squadron entered the fight with a severe disadvantage in initial time. They joined the active defense weeks after the relentless German offensive began. The Royal Air Force possessed veteran squadrons with huge head starts in the grim arithmetic of the air war. But the Polish pilots possessed a burning need to catch up to their British brothers in arms. The intelligence officers in the command bunkers started to notice a sudden shift in the routine combat reports. The kill claims from the foreign volunteers poured into the sector stations at a staggering rate. The strict British commanders demanded absolute proof for every single downed enemy machine. They sent reconnaissance planes to photograph the twisted wreckage scattered across the green countryside and the cold channel. The photographs confirmed a truth that shocked the entire chain of command to its core. The exiled pilots were destroying the heavy German bomber formations faster than any other unit in the sky. The sheer volume of falling enemy aircraft defied all standard expectations of modern aerial combat. The British officers compared the numbers of the Polish squadron to the records of their own finest veteran units. The results painted a picture of absolute dominance and supreme combat efficiency. The combination of the rugged British airframes and the aggressive foreign pilots created the ultimate defensive weapon. A standard interceptor squadron celebrated the destruction of 2 or 3 enemy bombers in a single chaotic engagement. The men of the 303 often returned to the grass airfields with claims of a dozen shattered targets. The British mechanics painted small white crosses on the sides of the Hawker Hurricanes to mark the confirmed victories. The metal sides of the rugged fighters soon became covered in a growing row of these stark white symbols. The ground crews cheered as the kill tallies grew with each passing day of intense combat. The incredible success of the squadron was not a product of blind luck or random chance. The Polish pilots treated the chaotic dogfights as a cold and calculated hunt for the most vulnerable prey. They possessed the profound ability to identify the weak points in the dense German defensive boxes. The exiled warriors used the brilliant maneuver properties of the British machines to exploit those precise weaknesses. They struck fast and hard before the enemy gunners could track their rapid movements across the sky. The German High Command noticed the sudden spike in their own casualty reports over that specific sector. The Luftwaffe generals could not comprehend the staggering loss of their finest bomber crews. They assumed the Royal Air Force had deployed a hidden secret weapon or a new type of advanced fighter plane. The enemy intelligence failed to realize the secret weapon was just a group of men fueled by pure hatred. The Polish Fury was a force multiplier that transformed the standard British machines into invincible predators. The British Fighter Command embraced the immense success of their fierce new brothers in arms. The initial doubts about the language barrier and the chaotic tactics vanished in the smoke of the falling bombers. The generals recognized that the Polish aggression was the exact medicine required to break the German momentum. They directed the 303 Squadron to the most active sectors of the ongoing battle. The foreign volunteers became the ultimate spearhead of the entire British defensive shield. The growing kill counts brought a renewed sense of profound hope to the exhausted British public. Newspapers published the staggering numbers and celebrated the fierce warriors from the fallen nation. The citizens of London looked up at the contrails in the sky and knew the Polish men were fighting for them. The island nation adopted the exiled pilots as their own heroes of the desperate hour. The shared struggle forged an unbreakable bond of profound gratitude and absolute mutual respect. but the staggering numbers on the chalkboards in the briefing rooms came with a steep and brutal cost. The Polish pilots directed their British machines straight into the teeth of the heavy enemy defensive fire. The aggressive point-blank tactics exposed the rugged Hawker Hurricanes to extreme amounts of kinetic damage. The mechanics worked countless hours to repair the shattered wings and the broken control cables. The high kill ratio required a constant sacrifice of aluminum and human endurance. The brutal nature of the close-quarters combat ensured that not every Polish pilot returned to the grass airfields. The exiled warriors shed their blood in the freezing air alongside their brave British counterparts. A sudden explosion in the clouds often signaled the tragic end of a fierce and dedicated fighter. The empty chairs in the squadron mess hall served as a grim reminder of the steep price of their success. The surviving men honored their fallen brothers by pushing the throttles forward and hunting more enemy bombers. The Royal Air Force commanders marveled at the immense resilience of the foreign volunteers in the face of severe loss. The Polish men did not allow grief to degrade their intense combat focus or their aggressive spirit. They channeled the pain of losing their friends into a colder and more precise application of raw violence. The death of a wingman meant the German Armada would face a terrifying retribution on the next mission. The squadron operated as a single living organism dedicated to the absolute destruction of the invaders. The combat statistics of the 303 Squadron became a profound legend within the British military ranks. The numbers proved that the initial British hesitation to arm the foreign pilots was a grave strategic error. The decision to unleash the Polish fury saved countless British lives and vital industrial centers. The exiled warriors repaid the gift of the brilliant British machines with a brutal harvest of shattered German steel. The strong alliance of engineering and aggressive spirit altered the entire course of the aerial campaign. The German bomber crews developed a deep fear of the specific British sector, guarded by the foreign volunteers. The enemy pilots recognized the aggressive and suicidal tactics that defined the Polish approach to aerial combat. The sight of a Hawker Hurricane diving straight into their tight formation caused absolute panic in the German cockpits. The Luftwaffe airmen knew the fierce warriors would not break off their attack until their heavy guns ran dry. The immense psychological terror inflicted by the squadron was just as profound as the physical destruction. The British sector controllers learned to utilize the raw aggression of the Polish pilots to their maximum tactical advantage. The radar operators vectored the 303 Squadron toward the largest and most dangerous enemy bomber streams. They knew the exiled warriors would tear huge holes in the German defensive boxes and create profound chaos. The veteran British squadrons would then exploit the resulting confusion and hunt the isolated enemy machines. The intense coordinated effort between the different units showcased the brilliant flexibility of the Royal Air Force. The unprecedented success of the foreign volunteers forced the German generals to reconsider their entire offensive strategy. The Luftwaffe could not sustain the brutal rate of attrition inflicted by the relentless British and Polish defenders. The large bomber formations failed to break the will of the island nation or destroy the vital fighter bases. The aggressive defense commanded a heavy toll in German blood and irreplaceable aeronautical machines. The invincible aura of the feared enemy air force shattered against the combined shield of the Allied nations. The incredible kill ratio of the Polish squadron stood as a clear testament to their profound combat skill. They achieved the highest destruction rate of any unit in the entire battle despite their severe late start. The raw numbers validated the intense and chaotic point-blank tactics that the British instructors had tried to erase. The Royal Air Force adapted its own standard doctrines to incorporate the brutal lessons learned from the foreign warriors. The vital exchange of tactical knowledge strengthened the entire British defensive network. The relationship between the British commanders and the Polish pilots evolved into a strong partnership. The strict officers learned to look past the broken English and the blatant disregard for standard aerial formations. They respected the undeniable results and the sheer courage required to charge a massive enemy bomber stream. The exiled men earned their place in the hallowed pantheon of British military heroes through raw action. The shared victory in the sky erased all borders and united the men in a true brotherhood of combat. The mechanics painted more bright white crosses on the rugged sides of the Hawker Hurricanes as the autumn approached. The confirmed kills accumulated at a pace that strained the stock of white paint on the busy airfields. The Polish pilots became feared aces and earned the highest medals of valor from the grateful British government. The men who had lost their entire nation found a deep sense of renewed purpose in the defense of another. The brutal air war gave them a perfect arena to strike back against the dark empire that destroyed their homes. The official combat logs of the Royal Air Force preserved the astonishing arithmetic of the fierce Polish squadron. The historians would stare at the stark numbers and marvel at the lethal efficiency of the foreign volunteers. The data proved that a small group of dedicated and motivated men could alter the outcome of a global strategic conflict. The combination of the heavy British guns and the fearless Polish hearts created a fierce and unstoppable force. The enemy swarms could not overcome the solid barrier of sheer will and superior mechanical engineering. The skies over the embattled island grew quieter as the German offensive broke against the relentless Allied defense. The heavy bomber formations stopped coming in the daylight and retreated to the safety of the dark night. The Royal Air Force and their fierce Polish brothers had won the bitter and desperate battle for the sun. The vital industrial centers and the airfields survived the relentless onslaught due to their profound sacrifice. The island nation stood firm because the men in the machines refused to yield a single inch of air. The incredible statistics of the 303 Squadron remain an enduring point of pride for both Allied nations. The numbers represent the absolute destruction of the enemy and the profound salvation of the free world. The British machines provided the reliable strength, and the Polish pilots provided the swift and fatal strike. The brutal arithmetic of the air war proved that the forged alliance was the ultimate key to absolute victory. The immortal legacy of the foreign volunteers is written in the official records of the British military archives. The chalk scoreboards in the sector command bunkers displayed a final, staggering tally that defied all initial expectations. The Polish warriors had shot down unprecedented numbers of enemy machines and secured their rightful place in history. The British commanders looked at the final results and felt a profound sense of absolute gratitude for the exiled men. The calculated risk of arming the foreign pilots had produced a rare and unprecedented defensive miracle. The unbreakable bond between the two nations was cemented forever in the cold and brutal numbers of the sky.